Swanns Way, starting at page 154. Often, too, we would go and take shelter, all crowded in together with the stone saints and patriarchs in the front porch of Saint André des Champs. How French that church was! Above the door, the saints, the night kings with fleurs-de-lis in their hands, wedding and funeral scenes were depicted as they might have been in Francois's soul. The sculptor had also narrated a certain anecdote involving Aristotle and Virgil, just as Francois in her kitchen was apt to talk about Saint Louis, as if she had known him personally, usually in order to put my grandparents to shame by comparison, since they were less fair-minded. One felt that the notions which the medieval artists and the medieval countrywoman living on into the 19th century had acquired of ancient or Christian history, which were distinguished by containing as much inaccuracy as simple good-heartedness, were derived not from books, but from a tradition that was at once very old and very direct, uninterpreted, oral, deformed, hardly recognizable, and alive. Another Combray character whom I also recognized, potential, and prophesied, in the Gothic sculpture of Saint André des Champs, was young Theodore, the delivery boy from Camus's grocery. Francois, in fact, felt so clearly that he was a fellow countryman and a contemporary that when my Aunt Leonie was too sick for Francois by herself to turn her over in bed or carry her to the armchair, instead of letting the kitchen maid come up and get into my aunt's good books, she would send for Theodore. Now this boy, who was taken, and rightly, for such a ne'er-do-well, was so filled with the same spirit that had decorated Saint André des Champs, and especially with the feelings of respect that Francois believed were owed to poor sick folk, to her poor mistress, that as he raised my aunt's head on her pillow, he had the same naive and zealous expression as the little angels in the bas-reliefs, crowding around the fainting Virgin with tapers in their hands, as if the faces of sculpted stone, bare and grey as the woods in winter, were only a deep sleep, a reserve, about to blossom into life again, in numberless common faces, reverent and crafty like Theodore's, illuminated with the redness of a ripe apple, no longer affixed to the stone like these little angels, but detached from the porch, of larger than human size, standing on a pedestal as though on a stool that spared her putting her feet on the damp ground. One saint had the full cheeks, the firm breasts, swelling the folds of the cloth like a cluster of ripe grapes in a horsehair sack, the narrow forehead, the short and saucy nose, the deep-set eyes, the able-bodied, impassive, and courageous demeanor of the countrywomen of the region. This resemblance, which insinuated into this statue a sweetness I had not looked for in it, was often authenticated by some girl from the fields who, like us, had come to take cover, and whose presence, like the presence of the leaves of a climbing plant that has grown up next to some sculpted leaves, seems intended to allow us, by confronting it with nature, to judge the truthfulness of the work of art. Before us, in the distance, a promised land or an accursed one. Ruzenville was now, when the rain had already stopped for us, either continuing to be chastised like the village in the Bible by all the slanting spears of the storm, which scorched the dwellings of its inhabitants, or else had already been pardoned by God the Father, who caused to descend upon it, unequal in length, like the rays of an altar monstrance, the frayed golden shafts of his reappearing sun. Sometimes the weather was completely spoiled. We had to go back home and stay shut up in the house. Here and there, far off in the countryside, which, because of the dark and the wet resembled the sea, a few isolated houses, clinging to the side of a hill, plunged into watery night, shone forth like little boats that have folded their sails and stand motionless out at sea all night long. But what did the rain matter? What did the storm matter? In summer, bad weather is only a passing, superficial mood on the part of the steady, underlying good weather, which is very different from the fluid and unstable good weather of winter. And having settled on the earth where it has taken solid form in dense branches of leaves on which the rain may drip without compromising the resistance of their permanent joy, has hoisted for the whole season, even in the streets of the village, on the walls of the houses and gardens, its flags of white or violet silk. Sitting in the little drawing room where I waited for the dinner hour while I read, I would hear water dripping from our chestnut trees, but I knew that the downpour was only varnishing their leaves, and that they would promise to stay there, like pledges of summer, all the rainy night, ensuring that the good weather would continue, that rain as it might. Tomorrow little heart-shaped leaves would undulate just as numerous above the white gate of Tansonville, and it was without sadness that I saw the poplar in the Rue de Perchamps meet the storm, praying and bowing in despair. It was without sadness that I heard at the back of the garden the last rolls of thunder warbling among the lilacs. If the weather was bad in the morning, my parents would give up the walk and I would not go out. But I later acquired the habit of going out to walk alone on those days along the Méséglise de la Vigneuse way. During the autumn in which we had to come to Combray to settle my Aunt Leonie's estate, because she had at last died, proving correct both those who had claimed that her enfeebling regimen would end up killing her, and those who had always maintained that she suffered from an illness that was not imaginary but organic, to the evidence of which skeptics would certainly be obliged to yield when she succumbed to it, and causing no great suffering by her death except to a single person, but to that one a grief that was savage. During the 2 weeks of my aunt's final illness, Francois did not leave her for an instant, did not undress, did not allow anyone else to care for her in any way, and did not leave her body until it was buried. Then we realized the kind of dread in which Francois had lived, of my aunt's ill-natured remarks, suspicions, angry moods, had developed a feeling in her that we might have taken for hatred, and that was actually veneration and love. Her true mistress, whose decisions were impossible to foresee, whose ruses were difficult to foil, whose good heart was easy to touch, her sovereign, her mysterious and all-powerful monarch, was no more. Next to her we counted for very little. The time was by now far in the past, as we began coming to spend our holidays at Combray. We possessed as much prestige as my aunt in Francois's eyes. That autumn, completely occupied as they were with the formalities that have to be observed, the interviews with notaries and tenants, my parents having scarcely any time to go on excursions, which the weather frustrated in any case, fell into the habit of letting me go for walks without them along the Méséglise way. Wrapped in a great plaid that protected me from the rain and that I threw over my shoulders, all the more readily because I sensed its Scottish patterning scandalized Francois, into whose mind one could not have introduced the idea that the color of one's own clothes had nothing to do with mourning, and to whom, in any case, the sorrow that we felt over the death of my aunt was not very satisfactory. Because we had not offered a large funeral dinner, because we did not adopt a special tone of voice in speaking to her, because I even hummed to myself now and then. I'm sure that in a book, and in this way, actually quite like Francois. Such a connection of mourning in the manner of Chanson de Roland, the portal of Saint-André des Champs, would have appealed to me. But as soon as Francois came near, some demon would goad me to try to make her angry. I would seize the slightest pretext to tell her that I missed my aunt because she was a good woman despite her ridiculous ways, but not in the least because she was my aunt. That she might have been my aunt and still seemed odious to me, and that her death would have not caused me any pain, remarks that would have seemed to me absurd in a book. If Francois, then, filled like a poet with a flood of confused thoughts about bereavement, about family memories, excused herself for not knowing how to answer my theories, and said, "I don't know how to express myself," I would gloat over that admission with a harsh and ironic common sense worthy of Dr. Percepit. And if she added, "All the same, she was your own kith and kindred, and there's a proper respect we owe to our kith and kindred, you know," I would shrug my shoulders and say to myself, "Look at me arguing with an illiterate woman who makes such blunders." Adopting and judging Francois the mean-spirited attitude of men whose behavior those people who despise them most when contemplating them impartially are quite capable of adopting when actually playing one of life's vulgar scenes. My walks that autumn were all the more pleasant because I took them after long hours spent over a book. When I was tired from reading all morning in the parlor, throwing my plaid over my shoulders, I would go out. My body, which had had to keep still for so long, but which had accumulated as it sat a reserve of animation and speed, now needed like a top that has been released to expend them in all directions. The walls of the house, the Tansonville hedge, the trees of the Roussainville woods, and the thickets at the back of Montjuvin submitted to the blows of my umbrella or walking stick, heard the shouts of joy, these being both merely confused ideas that exhilarated me, and found no repose in the light of understanding, because they had preferred, instead of a slow and difficult clarification, the pleasure of an easier diversion towards an immediate outcome. Most of the supposed expressions of our feelings merely relieve us of them in this way, by drawing them out of us in an indistinct form that does not teach us to know them. When I try to count up what I owe to the Méséglise, the humble discoveries for which it was the fortuitous setting or the necessary inspiration, I recall that it was autumn. It was that autumn, on one of those walks, near the bushy hillock that protects Montjuvin, that I was struck for the first time by this discord between impressions and their habitual expression. After an hour of rain and wind which I had fought cheerfully, as I came to the edge of the Montjuvin pond, beside a little hut covered in tiles, where Monsieur Vintois' gardener stowed his gardening tools, the sun had just reappeared, and its gildings, washed by the downpour, glistened freshly in the sky, on the trees, on the wall of the hut, on its still wet tile roof along the crest of which a hen was walking. The wind that was blowing tugged at the wild grass growing in the side of the wall and the downy plumage of the hen, then the one and the other streaming out at full length horizontally before its breadth, with the abandon of things that are weightless and inert. In the pond, reflective again under the sky, the tile roof made a pink marbling, to which I had never before given any attention. And seeing on the water and on the face of the wall a pale smile answering the smile of the sky, I cried out to myself in my enthusiasm, brandishing my furled umbrella, "Damn, damn, damn!" But at the same time, I felt I was in duty bound not to stop at these opaque words, and to try to see more clearly into my rapture. And it was at that moment, too, because of a countryman who was passing by, who seemed rather cross already, and was more so when my umbrella nearly went into his face, and who responded without warmth to my "Fine weather, isn't it? Perfect for a walk," that I learned that the same emotions do not arise simultaneously in a pre-established order in all men. Later, each time a rather prolonged session of reading had put me in a mood to chat, the friend I was so eager to talk to would himself have just been indulging in the pleasure of conversation and now wanted to be left to read in peace. If I had just been thinking tenderly about my parents and making the wisest decisions, those most likely to please them, they would have been employing the same time in discovering some peccadillo I had forgotten. Then they would reproach me severely for it just at the moment I bounded toward them to give them a hug. Sometimes the exhilaration I felt at being alone was jointed by another kind that I was not able to separate distinctly from it, and that came from my desire to see a peasant girl appear in front of me, whom I could clasp in my arms. Born suddenly and without having any time to identify what had caused it, from among different thoughts, the pleasure which accompanied it seemed to me only 1 degree higher than that which those other thoughts had given me. Everything that was in my mind at that moment acquired an even greater value. The pink reflection of the tile roof, the wild grass, the village of Rosenville, to which I had been wanting to go for so long now, the trees of its wood, the steeple of its church, as a result of this new emotion, which made them appear more desirable only because I thought it was that they had provoked it, and which seemed only to wish to carry me toward them more rapidly when it filled my sail with a powerful, mysterious, and propitious wind. But if, for me, this desire that a woman should appear added something more exhilarating to the charms of nature, in return, broadened what would have been too narrow in the woman's charm. It seemed to me that the beauty of the trees was also hers, and that the soul of those horizons, of the village of Rosenville, of the books I was reading that year, would be given to me by her kiss. And as my imagination drew the strength from my contact with my sensuality, as my sensuality spread through all the domains of my imagination, my desire grew boundless. And, too, just as during those moments of reverie in the midst of nature, when the effect of habit being suspended, and our abstract notions of things set aside, we believe with a profound faith in the originality and the individual life of a place in which we happen to be, the passing woman summoned by my desire seemed to be not an ordinary exemplar of that general type, woman, but a necessary and natural product of this particular soil. For at that time, everything which I was not, the earth and the other people, appeared to me more precious, more important, endowed with a more real existence than they appeared to grown men. And I did not separate the earth and the people. I desired a peasant girl from Méséglise or Rosenville, a fisherwoman from Balbec, just as I desired Méséglise and Balbec. The pleasure they might give me would have appeared less real to me. I would no longer have believed in it if I had modified its conditions as I pleased. To meet a fisherwoman from Balbec or a countrywoman from Méséglise in Paris would have been like receiving a seashell I could not have seen on the beach, a fern I could not have found in the woods. It would have subtracted from the pleasure which the woman would give me all those pleasures in which my imagination had enveloped her. But to wander through the woods of Rosenville, without a peasant girl to hold in my arms, was to see these woods and yet know nothing of their hidden treasure, their profound beauty. For me, that girl, whom I could only envisage dappled with leaves, was herself like a local plant, merely of a higher species than the rest, and whose structure enabled one to approach more closely than one could in the others the essential flavor of the country. I could believe this all the more readily, and also that the caresses by which she would allow me to reach that flavor would themselves be of a special kind, whose pleasures I would not have been able to experience through anyone else but her. Because I was, and would be for a long time to come, at an age when one has not yet abstracted this pleasure from the possession of the different women with whom one has tasted it, when one has not reduced it to a general notion that makes one regard them from then on as the interchangeable instruments of a pleasure that is always the same. This pleasure does not even exist, isolated, distinct, and formulated in the mind as the aim we are pursuing when we approach a woman, as the cause of the previous disturbance that we feel. We scarcely even contemplate it as a pleasure which we will enjoy, rather we call it her charm, for we do not think of ourselves, we think only of leaving ourselves. Obscurely awaited, imminent and hidden, it merely rouses to such a paroxysm at the moment of its realization. The other pleasures we find in the soft gazes, the kisses of women close to us, that it seems to us, more than anything else, a sort of transport to our gratitude for our companion's goodness of heart and for her touching predilection for us, which we measure by the blessings, by the beatitude which she showers upon us.